So imagine you're using a retirement planning tool and it tells you your chance of success is, let's say, 95%. What in the world does that mean? How is that number calculated? And is there some number we should aim for? I mean, what if it says 70%? Is that good enough to retire? Well, that's the question we're going to try to tackle in today's video. And it came up in an email I received from a viewer. Let me read it to you. This comes from a viewer named Tom. He says, I would like to hear your opinion on the trustworthiness or veracity of the retirement chance of success option in the tool. And he was referring to new retirement. I'll show you that tool in a minute. He says, when I toggle average assumptions, again, we'll talk about that in just a second, which I'm confident in my rates and figures, the tool informs me that I could retire in just under a year. But is this just a straight line calculation? Does it factor in things like impact to healthcare costs incurred as a result of retiring before Medicare eligibility? Well, those are great questions. And by the way, it can even come up if you're working with a financial planner because they have their own software. They run it through their own software. They come up with a chance of success just like we do if we're using a tool like New Retirement. You still have to understand that number, interpret it to have any confidence in what it's telling you. So we're going to do three things. First, I'm just going to walk through sort of the mechanics of how that number is calculated, answer some of Tom's questions. And then we're going to look at what some of the experts say you should aim for in terms of a chance of success, including Bill Bengen, the father of the 4% rule. He actually talks about this in one of his papers. And then I'm going to talk briefly about two factors that I don't think get mentioned enough in this conversation that, frankly, I think are the most important considerations when evaluating your plan's chance of success. So let's dive right in. The first thing I want to show you, we will get to New Retirement, but I actually want to show you FICalc first. Here it is. It's a free tool. I like it a lot. You put in how long you think your retirement will be, the value of your portfolio. You can click this box and put in your stock, bond, and cash allocation. You can even add fees if you're paying an advisor a fee. You can pick your withdrawal strategy. We're just using an inflation-adjusted strategy, not unlike the 4% rule, and how much you're going to withdraw each year. And you can see here, 96.7% chance of success. That seems pretty good. How does this tool calculate that? Well, we can actually come down here and it shows us all these, in this case, 30-year retirement periods. It actually begins all the way back in 1871, I believe. Yeah, 1871 to 1900. And it simply does all the math based on historical data, based on the historical market returns and inflation. And it simply asks one question. At the end of 30 years, and again, that's what we put in here. We could change that. But in this case, the end of 30 years, do we have at least $1 left? That's all it requires. If we have at least $1 sitting in our checking account, it's a success, and we get that green check mark you see there. If we run out of money, we're going to get a red X. Here we go. The late 60s were not good for retirees, so you get a red X. Now, this tool goes beyond that. It also lets you know a few other things. If you see this little money bag icon, if you can see that, it's a dollar money bag. That means you ended the 30 years with a truckload of money. In this case, if you retired in 1978 with $1 million, you ended 30 years with over $4 million. Wow. If you run out, you get the little peanuts. You got peanuts. That's all you got. And the roller coaster tells you there was a lot of volatility. And you've even got this I guess, sweaty emojicon, nervous face that says you didn't run out of money, but things got kind of, difficult towards the end. So this is a great tool. And again, it just adds up how many of these simulations were successful. You had at least $1 left. And how many were unsuccessful. And it just does the math. And in this case, it was 96.7% were successful and the rest failed. Now, in this case, it's not using what you would call Monte Carlo simulation. That's another way to run simulations. Let me show you that. And this will get to some of Tom's questions. New Retirement, just one of many. This is the tool I use, but it's just one of many tools you can use. And there are other very good ones out there. I like this one, but again, they all kind of do the same thing, maybe in a slightly different way. And when you see this chance of success, it's using a Monte Carlo simulation. Now, let's just talk briefly about that. Rather than looking at history, what a Monte Carlo simulation does is it just runs simulations where it sort of randomly picks certain returns for, say, stocks and bonds and inflation. And so some of these simulations are going to be very good, where the market's very strong and inflation's low. Some of the simulations are going to be awful, like the late 1960s. And not unlike FICalc, it's going to add up all of the simulations where you had at least $1 left at the end of your plan. That's a success. If you run out of money early, that's a failure, and it just gives you a percentage. In this case, go back to new retirement. I put a bunch of assumptions in this demo account. 95% of these simulations were successful. Now, one thing to note, when you look at new retirement and you see this top line, that's simply taking the assumptions I made about how much my portfolio would return every year and what inflation would be. And it just assumes we get those returns and that inflation each and every year in retirement. And so there is no chance of success there. You either run out of money before the end of your plan or you don't. It's as simple as that. And in fact, we can go to Pessimistic. I'll talk about this, what I'm doing here in just a minute, but we can switch it to Pessimistic. And you can see that it's doing the same thing, but this time it craters there at the end and you run out of money. Let me put it back to optimistic for just a minute. This bottom line is actually part of the Monte Carlo simulation. And what it's saying is you'll do this well or better 90% of the time. So that's a pretty low threshold. It's saying, look, there's only 10% of the simulations we ran ended up worse than this bottom line. You can actually go down to what's called Explorers here and run a more, I call it robust Monte Carlo simulation that runs 1,000 simulations. The one we just looked at a second ago runs 500, and it gives you the results here based on percentiles. So the bottom percentile, which is that bottom number, Monte Carlo 10th percentile, you end up with $900,000 at the end of the retirement planning period, again, based on all of the assumptions that I've put into this demo plan. So that's how it's calculated. The problem comes in is, okay, what number should we aim for? The one I just showed you said 95%. That's probably pretty good, right? Well, not necessarily. So let's first talk about what the experts say we should aim for, and then we have to really talk about two critical questions that I think most of the experts, frankly, don't talk about much. All right, so what do the experts say? Well, Bill Bengen. So we know he wrote his 1994 paper that gave us the 4% rule. 2 years later, he published a second paper, and he's published many, but he published a second paper, Asset Allocation for a Lifetime. Let me show it to you. And I'll leave a link to all of this. This is the paper. We can just go back to the top. You can see I've highlighted it, but there it is, Asset Allocation for a Lifetime. And in it, he actually addresses this question in a hypothetical back and forth with a hypothetical client. And what he ultimately says, page 6, I believe, maybe, whoops, here we go. It's right in this paragraph, and it starts right here. He says, I would advise you to be careful with any withdrawal rates having a probability of success much less than 85%. So that was Bill Bengen's view. He's okay with 85%, wouldn't go below that. And I found a number of financial advisors and financial planning firms that basically say the same thing, somewhere in the 85 to 90%. Now, I think that number in and of itself, I'm going to just say this now, is absolutely meaningless. I think this rule of thumb that says you should aim for, say, an 85% chance of success is absolutely meaningless and misleading even. They weren't misleading on purpose, of course, but they're leaving two things out. We'll get to that in a minute. Before we do, we need to look at one other expert, and here it is. This is from Michael Kitz's website, although he didn't write this article. Why 50% probability of success is actually a viable Monte Carlo retirement projection. It's a really good article. If this issue is really important to you, I recommend you read it. Again, I'll put a link to it below the video. But the article makes a couple of points. It first says, at a 50% chance of success, you have an equal chance of success versus having a plan that needs to be modified. You're not going to literally fail, right? We're not going to, like Thelma and Louise, drive our retirement car right off the cliff. If things aren't going well, we're going to make adjustments. So when we think about this chance of success, I like to think about it really more like chance of either having to modify our plan or not having to modify our plan. And at 50%, it's an equal chance. In some ways, we could think about it as we have an equal chance of overspending and having to modify our plan, or underspending and having a bunch of money left over at the end of the plan. The point this article makes, though, and this is going to sort of get us to the two things we really need to think about, is in their 50% plan, they said, look, you're able to make adjustments. If you have the flexibility in your retirement plan so that you can make adjustments, then maybe a much lower chance of success rate might work for you. So that's what the experts say. Again, I'll leave links below the video. Now let's get to really, I think, the two most important considerations that just, they don't get talked enough in some cases at all when these experts say, hey, 85% or 90%. And to do that, let's go to new retirement. So if we go back to the overview of this plan, it shows a success of 95%. I mean, that seems like under any circumstance, that should be great, right? Well, there's two things. The first is we don't know what assumptions are being made. We don't know how long this retirement is. We don't know what the assumptions are in terms of the rates of returns on the stock and bond portfolio. And that's really important, by the way, even in a Monte Carlo simulation, because it has to have an average of market returns and the variability of those returns fed into it in order for it to run the simulations, right? Otherwise, if it were just randomly picking numbers, it might assume a 900% return one year. Well, that's not helpful. So you put in average rates of return. In the case of new retirement, they provide the variability, and it uses that to run the simulations. But just looking at this number, we have no idea what those assumptions are. In new retirement, you can set an optimistic rate of return and inflation and a pessimistic rate. New retirement calculates the average, and then you can run the simulations based on either any of these three. In this case, it's set to optimistic. If we come over to the accounts and assets in this demo account, we can see that means a 9% return. That's what I set the optimistic rate at. So yes, it's got a 95% chance of success, but we're using a fairly optimistic rate of return. And for inflation, our optimistic rate of inflation is just 2% for general inflation and only 2.5% from medical inflation. The point being, when we're evaluating our plan's chance of success, we have to understand what kind of assumptions we're making. Are we making rosy assumptions that everything's going to go well? Or perhaps are we making really dire assumptions where, the world as we know it's going to fall apart? Maybe both are a bit unrealistic, but it's really important to evaluate the chance of success in light of the assumptions that we're making. If we go back to new retirement, I generally, when I'm doing an optimistic assumption, I like to see around 90%. Yes, that number is somewhat arbitrary, and we still have a second point to get to that's really, really important. I'll get there in just a second. But if I'm assuming, that, pretty much everything is going to be a walk in the park in my retirement, I want a pretty good chance of success. I kind of put it at roughly 90% for me. That's just my comfort level. If we go to pessimistic, in this particular plan, we drop to 33%. But that might not concern me. Again, I would want to go back and see, okay, what are my assumptions? Well, for pessimistic, I'm assuming a 5% rate of return. That's not over the next few years. That's over, in this case, a 30-year retirement. And that means I'm assuming a 4% rate of inflation. So I'm barely beating inflation with my investments for 3 decades. And I'm actually underperforming inflation, medical inflation, by 1.5 or by 0.5%. So this is a pretty pessimistic set of assumptions. And given that, for me, I don't know if I've set a number at it, but certainly I would probably be comfortable at 50% and maybe even as low as 33% or even lower potentially, depending on just how pessimistic my assumptions are. And that gets me to the second point that I don't think it's talked enough about, and that is how flexible are we with our spending assumptions? So you could imagine 2 different retirees, they put in the numbers and they're both at, say, an 85% chance of success. It looks like their plans are equally valid. But what if in one case, the retiree needs literally every single dime of expense they've put into, in this case, new retirement or your retirement planning tool of choice? They need every dime of it. They can't, there's no flexibility. They can't cut back. They need that just to pay the bills and the rent and everything else. Whereas the other retiree has a lot of flexibility built in. There's a lot of money in there for travel and hobbies and just things they'd like to do, but things they wouldn't have to do to survive. And it's that flexibility in spending that Kitces article sort of addressed to some extent with that 50% chance of success approach to retirement planning. At the end of the day, whatever you decide is best for you, I think we always have to ask the question, yes, but what if things don't work out as we planned? We can put all of the most realistic assumptions we can generate that we can possibly think of in a financial plan. If it doesn't work out and we need to cut our spending, how much flexibility do we have? If we have a lot of flexibility, I think a lower chance of success can make a lot of sense for some people. If you don't have a lot of flexibility, then I would want a much higher chance of success. And how this can play out is deciding when to retire. If you need every dollar in your plan to spend, and you're maybe at an 80 or 90% chance of success, working another year or two, I know that may not be your plan A, but working another year or two can make a big, big difference in setting you up for a successful retirement down the road. So there you go. That's my take on chance of success. Would love to hear your thoughts on it. And of course, if you have questions either way, leave them in the comments below. I'll be happy to help you out any way I can. And until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.